How are we going to get the young people back into church? In this episode of the MyCom Church Communications and Marketing Podcast, we're addressing ideas around this, seemingly age-old question. We're being joined by Kristopher Sledge and Rachel Gilmore. They are both pastors, and together they authored the book Followers Under 40, which addresses the relationship between the church and young adults. There are some key things that the church needs to understand about our younger generations. And Kris and Rachel will help us begin to look at how these generations relate to institutions and meaning making differently than our previous generations. We're also going to hear some of their practices that help them connect with younger people, which, let's face it, many of us feel really uncomfortable doing. Kris Sledge is the lead pastor of the Journey Church, which is a multi-ethnic church in urban Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Rachel Gilmore is the director of New and Vital Faith for the Desert Southwest Conference of the United Methodist Church. She has experience as a church planter and planting consultations as well. If this conversation and conversations like it are valuable to you, then show your appreciation by hitting the subscribe button on your podcast listening platform and leaving a rating and review. That's a big help in bringing MyCom to other people who might really benefit from hearing these conversations. So let's get into this conversation here on MyCom about understanding youth culture, connecting with social issues, embracing digital tools, and a whole lot more. Rachel and Kris, thank you so much for joining us on the MyCom Podcast. We're talking about followers under 40, and as I was reading through the book, I kept thinking about whether or not Jesus ever had to answer questions about getting young people engaged in the ministry. Do you think that Pharisaical leaders were posing these questions to Jesus? How do we get more kids?
I mean, perhaps, right? Jesus wasn't trying to bring... there were people to bring to the temple. He was preaching to thousands of people in the Sermon on the Mount and was trying to reach blue-collar folks that had day jobs, right? But I would say, perhaps it was more culturally appropriate, or there was more peer pressure, societal pressure to be a good Jewish boy or girl or person and engage in the faith. Maybe. I think historically we've looked at folks just distancing themselves from organized religion. But people, I would say something that is the same is folks were ticked off with the way church or religion was done, and they were disenfranchised, disheartened. And so Jesus literally tried to create a way of connecting to those who weren't actively connected to God. And I don't know, Kris, what do you think?
Yeah, so totally, all of that. I also think... I think Jesus had this way of really lifting up and prioritizing those from in society we're not normally. So I just think about the story when, Jesus says to his disciples, no, let the kids come to me. I think there was a way in which Jesus prioritized, lifted up those who were young, even when I think maybe the disciples who were pure at heart, right, thought maybe it was a bit distracting or Jesus had better things to do. Jesus actually, I think, spent some time. So I think in some ways there maybe have always been this tension around how to faithfully share the story of Jesus with the next generation, and doing that in a way that that I think that's honoring to Jesus. Jesus himself, lifted up and prioritized the conversation of those who are young. And so for me, I think that's what I would say. And maybe at times the Pharisees thought, or not, maybe the disciples thought that it was Jesus was too busy for the adults. But maybe Jesus thought, actually, no, I'm going to prioritize those who are young, and they also have a seat. And so we also have to talk about them. We have to think about how we can engage them in faith and conversation, even for the church today. So right now, I don't know. I think that's what I would say to that question.
Right on. Yeah, it's a great point you bring up, though, about engaging within the culture in the day. In your book, you've noted that young people today really kind of see themselves as having a brand. So in order for us to get to know you here on the MyCom Podcast, how would you describe your personal brand? Or we can even branch it out to your ministry's brand. But how would you describe it? Rachel, let's start with you.
Oh, that's okay. Fascinating. I describe my brand. I think so. When I was in the Peace Corps, they gave me a description at our closing ceremony that I still think is kind of appropriate. At least people in my church were like, oh yeah, that sounds like you. So I was described as the sweetest general you'll ever love. And so maybe that's kind of my brand. Or right now in my role on conference staff in the Desert Southwest, sometimes people call me the annual conference cheerleader. So I would say my brand is kind of like this. I have lots of energy, lots of joy and enthusiasm. And specifically, I try to like funnel that energy and joy into helping people, into like midwifing connection between others and community. So that's my brand, I guess. I don't know. What about you, Kris? What's your brand?
Wow.
This is Enneagram 3s.
So it is.
Else.
Ron, I don't really love the question, but I understand it. So you're submitting that up front, right? Yeah. So brand, I think there might just be words that I would use to describe who I think people have said that I am and who I want to be on my best days. So I think people have said to me things like, Kris, I think you're like charismatic, highly relational, a listener, right? I actually like, maybe a way in which I want to describe that, like, I want to be a healing presence in the world. And so even in the midst of conflict or the midst of, just turmoil, like I want to be a restorative presence and to help be part of the healing of the world. But I think really, if I appreciate the way, like Rachel, like cheerleader, that was one word described to you. Like, I just want to be an encourager. I think I recognize I can be pessimistic, or we can be pessimistic. I want to be an encourager. So I think that's my brand, to be an encouraging healer in the world that probably, like Rachel, has a lot of energy, and so cares the charisma of that. It's just that's who I hope to be. And maybe to think about my context. I think that my context sometimes has some flavoring of me as well, and so I think for us, like, how are we just part of the healing in our particular city and our spot in the world here in Pennsylvania?
Yeah. I appreciate you both not shying away from the question there, because when we do start throwing around words like brand and branding, it can be a turnoff in the church world. But I think the brand is just a way of letting people know who we are. And maybe that's kind of a shortcut way of speaking about branding. But it's there. It's the opening of a relationship. It's letting people know who we are. And churches, I think, sometimes have this fear of maybe wandering away from brand because they don't want to be pigeonholed. And in and of itself, that can be a little misleading to younger generations. And that encourages a brand perception that maybe the church is a little bit inauthentic. I'd love to be able to explore a little bit more about how younger people are seeing the church, but I also want to talk about how the church sees younger people themselves. And you all have encapsulated this so well. Kris is ready to go on this question. So
I don't know.
What are we kind of misunderstanding about younger generations within the, big church?
Yeah, so a lot. So I'll just start a little bit, and then Rachel can fill in. I think part of one of the ways I would say that exists is I think there's a misconception about young people around like religion in general, like that there's a thought that like they don't want to engage in religion. I think part of what's happening is they don't want to engage in like organized church, big box church, the way in which the church has done harm. So I think that's a misconception. I think there's a misconception around technology and the use of technology, the way in which they engage in that. I think that like there's a like misconception around like work ethic, or they're like I think about brand language. I think all of that actually, and I would say actually, and I was just thinking about this yesterday, like the three emerging generations that we talk about in our book, like I really think like they're incredible generation that have so much to offer, but yes, they are distinct than my parents or the generation above, because it's a whole different world with technology, terrorism, the global nature of all of it. I mean, there's a different world that we're living in, and so I think they're deeply misunderstood. And I think maybe one way to capture that for me is, I think the next generation has a deep sense of like wanting everything to be like deeply authentic and honest and real, like fake and like things that are inauthentic, I think, will no longer. So clergy, churches that are trying to be someone that they're not, or I think there's a depth, and they want to get beyond, maybe what people think, but they want to go to something deeper. I don't know. Rachel, say help me out. You know better than I do.
No, well, I mean, I do have a Gen Z and a Gen Alpha at home, and I'm fascinated daily by them. But I echo everything you said. I think it's a struggle for most of our churches, because if you look at the fact that, what is it? In Protestant mainline churches, 42% of folks on a Sunday are over 65 years old, right? When only 17% of the population in the U.S. is over 65. So anyone under 40 who walks into a church will automatically feel maybe like a unicorn or like an innocent child in a room of vampires, right? That's trying to sustain and extend their life by just sucking the life out of you. Like, join this committee, be in the bell choir. Like, why don't you help us hand out bulletins? Because we love using excessive paper every week, right? Which, again, with the younger generation, feels like a disconnect. So they come in and they feel like they're being assimilated into not faith necessarily, but a way of living out faith that after the postlude and the organist is done, like, the lives of the people in the pews don't always show them the teachings of Jesus. And not to be like judgmental, we're all struggling to follow Jesus more faithfully, but you just look in the news today, right? Like a bishop says, hey, let's be merciful to the marginalized, and Christians are freaking out. Like, how dare she say that? And so like I think younger generations, I just had this fascinating conversation with my kids, because they're like, Mom, we only have one more month before we have to listen to this music. And like, we have to move from bulking to cutting. And I was like, what on earth? To the brand point, right? Like, I don't understand it. But like, these digital natives were born into a world with limitless possibilities and options. Anything they wanted to know or do, they had access to. And so what they're drawn to is kind of the reverse of us. I was like, I want to listen to new bands. I want to go to new places. And they want more discipline, like more structure, to like, they've learned the art or the joy in saying, what if it's not best for me to access anything I want anytime I want it? Like, to really have a disciplined life that gives me more meaning, that makes it more intentional. So I think to Kris's point too, they want an authentic life. They want a full and rich life. They are not they're not going to go to church because their boss is sitting in the pew and they want to get a promotion in their 9-to-5 job that they hate. Like, these younger generations just will not be tied to a life that doesn't feel life-giving. And so that's the challenge for churches. Like, what are we doing or offering that can really help transform the lives of younger generations? Most of us don't know how to do that or where to start.
Kris, in your ministerial context with Journey Church, I perceive that if we were to do a comparison chart against most United Methodist congregations, yours would be on the younger end. How would you say, or let me just ask this question. How did you reach people?
Great question, Ryan. That is the question for any church right now. Of
how did you start the relationship? Maybe that's the question.
Yeah. So I always like to say the stat. Like 65% of our church is under the age of 40. And that sounds great in theory, and it has all of its limitations that we can happily talk about at some point. But for me, I think when I began leading the journey a couple of years ago, we made some really intentional decisions around like asking the question, not what are we going to do, but who are we going to be? And so we regularly ask the question around like culture, who are we being in community? And then from there, beginning to decide, well, what will we do, right? What we do, like the programmatic side is so like, it's there at the journey. Like, we're an established church. We have all the things, but the things that we do don't matter as much as who we are. So some of the things that like I really care about is like, I want us to be a church that like can engage thoughtfully with the things that matter in the world. So right, one of the clear things is like, I'm willing to engage in any conversation on any topic from the pulpit and from large group teaching to say, how are we helping take what young people or all people are experiencing day to day in their life, Saturday nights when they're at their club, like when they're at the club on a Saturday night and they're dealing with all these things of the world, drugs and the the thoughts around like, how to learn how to say no and when people try to make advances on you, like, can I on Sunday morning help create meaning out of that for their life? And if I can't as a clergy person, then the question of like, is this even relevant to my life comes to mind, right? And so for me, it's like, I'm always thinking like, how can I help share the old story of this Jesus in a way that helps people really create meaning, healing, purpose, structure out of the chaotic world in which we're living. So that's number one. Number two, the Lewis Center, like a couple of years ago, created this great study that said, those who are the age of 40 or 50, they're much more forgiving when they see young people on the stage. But those who are younger are not so forgiving when they only see those over the age of 50 on the stage from up front. And so for me, I try to orient to say, I want us to, when we have young adults, it's like, I have to regularly think about how we're a young adult church. And that's not official language, but how am I giving voice to those who are younger? And so when you come on a Sunday morning, you're going to see on the stage 2, 3, 4, 5 people under the age of 30. Like, I'm the old guy sometimes when I'm on the stage, right? And I'm in my mid-30s. And so for me, it's like trying to give the keys to this thing called the church, the journey, away to the very people in which we want to be in relationship with. I think another thing that goes back to the thing that matter is that we're really willing to engage in the social concerns of the day. And so not from a politically correct standpoint, I'm pretty clear about that. We're not even following the whims of the air of what's going on, but to say, I want to teach my people how to the theological and biblical structure to how to navigate the social concerns of the day. And so, so we're willing to talk about all of that. So I think those are a couple of things, right? I'm not even sure how even programmatic they are. But that's really for me. And this is the most programmatic thing I'll say, Ryan, is I invest more in kids ministry than I do anywhere else in our church. Okay. And so that's the one clear nugget I might say to like, if I want to be a church that has young families, I need to prioritize and support that. And so we made some hard decisions throughout the years to make sure that our kids' space is the best space in our entire church.
Rachel, as you're consulting with church startups and new ministries, do you have similar recommendations, like really pay attention to young people's ministry, kids' ministry, maybe choose a social issue? Or
actually, if a church wants to try to reach younger generations, for me, so because of some of the work that Kris and I do with this group called Intersect, it's a co-planting network that really wants to create new ways of doing ministry that are equitable, diverse, innovative, contextual, and post-colonial. So my first kind of encouragement for churches is to live into that post-colonial side and don't say, well, if I build it, they will come. Like, they will come to me and I will show them what faith is and who God is. So I would encourage churches to get out of the church and go listen to the community, put themselves in spaces where young adults, young families, young people, teens are present, like volunteer at a local school, sell hot dogs and nachos at the football game, whatever it might be. And to your point earlier about branding, I encourage these churches to do the Ask 3 challenge. So find 3 people who are young adults, and you have to meet them within 10 minutes of your church building. So someone at a gas station or your server at a restaurant, right? And just say, hey, Kris, you've been great at Denny's. Like, if I'm looking for a church on Sunday, where should I go? And see what Kris says. If it's like crickets and Kris is like, I don't really go to church. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, thanks for telling me. Is there a reason why? Or you don't have to share, but just to learn. And I'm not going to say, Kris, you should come to First UMC Sunday. That's the best church. I'm the pastor.
Yes.
But if Kris says, oh, well, the Catholic Church is amazing because of their issues on this and this, or I love this. So just find out, do they even go to church? If they do, what church would they recommend? And why? And that tells you more about your brand. Like, do people even know you're there? Do they think, oh gosh, don't go to First UMC because everyone there is so judgmental, or all they want is your money, or whatever. But it gives you a starting point for saying, what do I need to change? Like, are there needs in our community around social justice? And so maybe our church needs to have more of a voice or influence in that. In our community, is there nowhere for college students to gather? And we need to create a coffee shop or a third space, right? So we need to kind of begin by getting out of our walls and connecting with those that we're trying to reach, and really hearing their needs. One of my favorite quotes from William Temple is, The church is the only institution that exists for the benefit of those who are not yet members. So how do we really make church not about keeping people in the pews happy, but all the people who need to know God's love?
And I just, if it's all right, Rachel, I think maybe one way in which maybe we've lived that out that I just appreciate the way in which you've named that is I think for us at the journey, like we're pretty like city oriented around who we are. And I think one way in which we've been able to be in relationship with a significant number of young adults is that I think they want to, I want to be about changing the world by changing lives, to see human flourishing, to have a clear commitment that's external, not internal. Yes, we gather internal for worship, in our sanctuary, but really the orientation is how are we seeking the welfare of the very place which God has sent us? For us, it's Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And something maybe part of our Rachel research, Rachel, like something like I think there's a deep desire to influence the world. I think that's the influencer generation, right? And so if we can't influence it in a technological persuasion, I think we can do that at living that out of the gospel, right? And so, and then creating that kind of safe space internal for people, at least in our part of the world, which is a pretty purple region, to create space for people like who are trans, who are Black or queer, to find space that they can wrestle with their faith and their identity in a safe space that's they can do that. So I just wanted to add to that. And I think that having a mission beyond yourself and to seek the literal for us, the human flourishing of our city, there's something about that I think captures why people come to the journey.
Within the book, you mentioned several conversations that you both had, with just kind of almost like focus group conversations. So you brought up eating at Denny's and maybe talking to the waitress, but it sounds like there were several conversations that were a little bit more planned where you're meeting up with young people at a coffee shop. How might a church start to open a conversation in that way as well?
Gosh. I would say look at your existing church, and if you have some young adults, so for instance, I don't serve a local church here, but my husband does, but it's in a retirement town, so you have to be 55 to even buy a home there. So my kids, they love the church, and yet there is no one young there. So I was like, okay, we have these two teens. They love this one particular coffee shop, so we go there one Sunday morning a month, and they invite all their friends, and they'll tell me about their lives, who they're frustrated with, who drove them crazy, or what questions they have. And then at the end, they'll say, what does God think about this? And we'll look at some scriptures together. Back to Kris's point, how is my life different because I have insight into what God or the Word of God says about what I'm going through? So that's a way that we're learning more about what young adults are struggling with, what they need, who they are. So if you have some folks, just figure out where do you like to go and what would you need. Other churches, if there are local fairs or farmers markets and you just, said, hey, I'm here, have a confessional booth or a way that you can name the harm the church has done, but also invite feedback and honesty about what they need or who they are. There are lots of just different opportunities. Or, Brian, I'm such a nerd with this, but there are 3 forms of anthropological listening you can do. So even if you just went to a coffee shop by yourself and you don't want to seem weird and creepy, like walking up to a table of total strangers, although I did it for the book repeatedly, but you could just sit there and not be creepy, but just listen, who's here? What are they talking about? Yeah. Are they all coming from a Pilates class, or are they grabbing coffee on their way to work construction, or, and just learn from being present in the spaces around you. I don't think a lot of our church folk do that. And I always remind folks that I talk to in my consulting work, just the hardest thing for us is to actually be normal Christians. Just be a normal person and relatable. Don't try to scare people or walk the Romans road with them 5 minutes into a conversation, because with younger folks like that, don't do turn or burn stuff with bullhorns, right? So, I don't know. Yeah, just try something and plan on it failing a couple of times and just keep going, right? You have to be gritty and resilient in this work, for sure. I don't know, Kris, thoughts?
Yeah, same. I think we've missed the mark of just being a good listener, and to not assume we know anything about our community. So I for the first couple years, I just acted like I didn't know anything and just asked a lot of questions, which maybe I had assumptions, but then I just was able to listen and then say, like, who else do I need to be listening to and who else do I need to be talking to? And so my first couple years, I was known to be like, I met with mayor, fire, police, right? Like police, like I just like anyone who would like give me an hour to say, I just want to like ask questions around our community. And never to like, recruit them to church or Romans Road. Oh my gosh, that's like haunting the thought of all of that. And another, so just like that, and also like just how do we live our life and just like as clergy or as leaders, like it's like going to the gym and just like making friendships, never for the purpose of inviting them to church. And so some of my favorite people in my city, they don't come to my church, right? But I've learned a lot about the nature of this particular place just from engaging in friendship. Now, some of them have come to my church or are super encouraging of it, but it's never been about that. And so I think that's like, I don't want to be a church planter that just wants to build relationships to grow my number of church members, but I want to grow my relationship as a church planter just to learn more and be in a relationship with the very people. And then I have language, insight, stories, examples to understand this space. And then, Ryan, maybe to say the easiest thing is like every congregant in America has children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren that they are in regular relationship with. And if they don't have that, they have a niece or a nephew or a neighbor or someone in their sphere who is younger than they are. I also would just say, how do we ask those who are already in our world to say, if we did this whole church thing over again, if we could start over, what would it look like? There's a humility in that for that elder to ask that question. But goodness, if more elder, seasoned, wise people would ask that question, I think it would radically shape the church today.
I totally agree. I'm going to throw in one more thing. Ryan, sorry.
Absolutely. Keep it going.
Back and forth. We're loving this. So like, I'm just mindful of who might be listening to this. And if you are a pastor in like a small aging congregation and you're like, oh my gosh, my people won't change anything. They won't let us do anything differently to reach younger generations. You might feel that way. But to Kris's point, you talk to Aunt Edna, who's a matriarch of the church, and you make a change and do a messy church on a Sunday instead of like your strict order of worship, and her kids and grandkids actually come with her and enjoy it. Right. Aunt Edna is now like team captain of young adult ministry, right? So yeah, that relational time, like actually seeing, because I think there's a lot of grief. I can't even imagine how sad people are to have poured their entire lives into building up this church for their kids and their grandkids, and they want nothing to do with it. Like, it's heartbreaking. And so we need to name how hard that is and say, gosh, if you do want them there, though, what you built has to maybe be rebuilt. Well, significantly rebuilt, right? It's not just a minor change here and there, but it's doable. And it's for God's kingdom, right? Like, Amen. That's why we're all here.
Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing that up, because my mind did go to that area. You church planners have it so easy, Kris, and that you just get to kind of...
I'll take it.
Dictate how it goes from the get-go, right? In terms of navigating culture to a degree, there's a digital aspect to these younger generations that the church is awakening to, but maybe hasn't grabbed onto yet. Like, we recognize as an institution the need to be in digital spaces. Any kind of mindset that maybe you want to recommend for some churches or church leaders out there who are thinking about, well, okay, so I know younger folks engage digitally. They even they deepen their relationships through digital means. I would love to be a part of that. Well, where do I put my foot in the door, so to speak?
That's so good. I think Kris and I might have very different answers on this.
I hope so.
We have interactions with technology. So, I mean, okay. I think any church now has to have a strong digital footprint. Back to your brand, right? Like, so it all starts with, gosh, do you have a website? And is it like stock photos, or is it actual authentic pictures of your folks? Like, can you actually navigate it on an iPhone? And if you can't, like, so just basic website principles. My 13-year-old daughter is on staff for a nursing home in Illinois, and we live in Arizona, to design their flyers. And it takes her like 5 minutes, but it would take them 50 hours, right? So find a young person to help you with branding that is authentic and true to who you are. And be findable, and pick the platforms on social media that align with the age group you're trying to reach. So if you're trying to target a geriatric millennial like me, you want to use Facebook and Instagram. If you're targeting Gen Z, Gen Alpha, look at TikTok and what's my presence there. And if you're not ready as a church to have a presence because it would feel fake or contrived, just spend time, on the young side of TikTok and like see what they're talking about or what the trends are or whatever it might be. And then what I encourage folks to do is to move from your social media space to a parasocial kind of relationship. So how do I lead it to a level where when they're watching my Facebook Live or my TikTok, they feel like they're actually connecting to me, and then move it from there to some kind of relational one-on-one connection through DMs, through Discord, through other ways of really creating belonging and community, because young people consume technology at ridiculous rates. And you can read The Anxious Generation, right? And see some of the mental harm that's being done because they're just constantly comparing themselves to all these images. But they are also really longing to be known by people. And a digital space is a great first step to foster in-person or online gatherings where you can make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So, I don't know, Kris, thoughts?
All of that. Yes. I think maybe the easiest way for me to articulate this is even to reimagine like how we engage with our community, and maybe the fancy word is like pastoral care, right? And so I always like to think about like the way in which I engage with my church is not through solely in-person gatherings and phone calls, right? I don't think I've called half of my church under the age of 40. I think they'd be like, stop calling me, text me, right? And so for me,
or at least let me know when you're going to call me, right?
Yeah, right. Like let's plan. Let's text about it first, figure out the content, and then schedule the call, right? So part of it for me is just to say, and I'm not like a digital native, like outside of social media. Like I don't live my life solely on technology, right? I'm an in-person person over a beer or coffee. Like that is my jam. But I've come to realize that some of my best conversation with folks in my church, the best way we can engage is through digital means, right? Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, and even YouTube, actually. And so I would echo all of the quality. I think there's a tension, like I think quality social media, and maybe the way I like to think about how we use social media, which has been really beautiful, is like use it as a means to tell our story more than it is to advertise events. And so we are quicker to post our images and quick little like fun little videos that we put together that someone who's a Gen Z on my staff can make. I don't know how you do it, but she does. And it's not even her paid job. Maybe I should say this. Her job is not to do technology, but she can make these videos so quickly that I'm like, at this event, make a video. And she does it. And it's like, you make us look so good. So part of it is just like, how do you just tell the story of what God is doing in your community and the compelling, life-giving stuff that's occurring? Put that on social media. Don't simply just put your service from the camera in the back of the room on. That's all you do. I think we're missing out on the beautiful thing. And then maybe like Rachel, just find someone who's super young, give them $1,000 to say, go do something really quick, and make something really meaningful, and just to tell that story. Yeah, I think that's probably the best. But this is so not my wheelhouse, but I'm growing in it every day, Ryan.
There's something that's been gnawing at me in talking about social issues and not being afraid to address those. We brought that up as being a need. I know plenty of church leaders who maybe from maybe more my generation, which is Gen X or older, who would hear something like that and think, oh my gosh, like that is the scariest thing, because I know that inevitably I'm going to irk somebody. Somebody's going to get offended or feel like I'm not speaking for their needs within that. So how do you kind of navigate that tension of needing to speak towards some of the more polarizing issues and not being afraid of moving away from those, and yet, I don't know, not alienating people in the same vein?
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple of things.
Kris, Rachel, you take it. You take it. Okay.
So I'm going to answer two different ways. Number one, I would say the conversation around, social concerns, I want to make sure that we name that often when we talk about social concerns, we're not talking about issues, we're talking about people. And so I would always want to orient this conversation. We're not talking about an issue that's like on the news, but like we're talking about people, real lives, right? That are being affected by policy or marginalization or whatever it is. So first, orient it always in like people, and then we have a theology around people, right? Imago Dei, grace, right? Like we're people of prevenient grace. So we're believing that God is going before all people. So we oriented in that, but also I think as we oriented around people is that we so often I think the pulpit's been the only mechanism that's used to engage in this conversation. And so some of the ways in which we've done it in our context is actually we have something called quarterly deep dives at the Journey, quarterly deep dives with Pastor Kris. And we'll take a hot topic and we'll spend 3 hours engaging this hot topic on a Sunday night. And to tell you, Ryan and Rachel, like I'll get 100 people, 100 young adults who are willing to engage quarterly around a deep conversation. So we're willing to talk about the topic, like, whoa, right? Then I'm willing to do my hard work of like offering a theological or biblical framework around this topic, right? Depth, content, and then we wrestle for an hour around, okay, and let us, what do we do together? And so I think if we only orient around the pulpit, it never creates this necessary space to be in conversation and dialogue that sometimes hot topics require. But again, often if we orient around people. Now, one more thing I'll just say is often Black church has figured this out. The Black church has been the center in the civil rights movement before and now to have a prophetic voice in the world today. And so I would just actually challenge any clergy person who's struggling to say, like, let's look at other models, like other clergy persons, other faith traditions, like the AME tradition, for instance, right, that are siblings to us, is to say, how have they figured it out? And I think I think the Black church has always understood the tension between social and personal holiness. And I think so often in white Protestant, white United Methodism, it's only been personal holiness, and I think we've missed something of social. So I would just say, like, I think there are really good examples out there that are often outside of our tradition who've navigated this work.
And I echo everything Kris said. Can you see why we wrote a book together? It's like,
Get out of my head. Yeah, got it.
Oh, right. So a couple things I would say is, it's our history as United Methodists, right? It was a bunch of college kids going crazy and taking faith seriously that created the denomination that we have today. And they did it with schools and with helping people when they had a cold and couldn't afford medical care, right? Like, it's not antithetical to our faith. It's like the history and origin of our particular denomination. And then I remind people that for young adults, there are some issues. They're not polarizing political issues. They're just right or wrong. So from a pulpit, don't say, well, I remember when I was a student at Duke and doing my internship, there was a pastor in North Carolina, we share that history, who was like, this president is a baby killer, and do not do that. We're not doing that. That's to Kris's pulpit point. But there are times where, like post 9/11, right? If a young adult came to church and you didn't mention it, or the school shootings in any way, and say, gosh, tragic lives are lost. Like, after Sandy Hook, I'm like, guys, there are Christmas presents under the tree that children, kindergartners, will not be opening. And that breaks my heart. It should break our hearts that people are like falling apart and should not be harmed like this, right? So young adults are going to come not thinking it's a political issue. It's a life issue. And so if you don't care about it, then you don't care about the things they do, and they feel more disconnected. And to Kris's point, like, yes, don't make it pulpit centric necessarily. We would, and start with low hanging fruit. Like, one time I preached a sermon series on justice and had different stations, and they could pick one. And at one of the stations, you're signing a petition to look at all the Indigenous women whose lives were lost and spend more money on like helping to solve those crimes. So for some people that might have issues that send them into a tailspin, that was something that was easy to take a stand on. Or there's a pastor in New York, Susan, and every Palm Sunday, because she considers Palm Sunday like a protest for Jesus, right, against the empire. So everyone makes their own protest sign of what they think God is telling us to do in this world, and they put them all out in front of the church. And so it's a way of everyone finding their voice and advocating for the change that they want to see. So there are ways to do it that engage the whole congregation, but to your point, Ryan, yes, they're in the bell curve of innovation as we're trying to reach new people in new ways. Like somewhere between 6 and 16% of folks are the never adopters. They will never, ever like change. They will never like anything that you do. They will never like any sermon you preach because that all feels political. And so our willingness to release with love, to entrust those people to God, to stay or to find another church home, because we won't let them hold the church hostage when good can be done. So it's, I guess, who was it? Mike Slaughter called it like holy subtraction or something. So don't be afraid to lose a few people if, my gosh, you're full of predominantly folks under 40 like Kris's church, and therefore it might be open long enough for your funeral to be celebrated there. I don't know. It's a harsh reality, friends, but we're in that place. I don't know.
It is because, is it fair to say, Rachel, that for some of these young adults, like it's that their lives are being affected by what's occurring, and so for some, they're just looking for a religious, spiritual leader to give hope and healing and redemption to their lived life. If it's not theirs, their community, their friends, or what their generation is experiencing. And so some, it's like, it would almost feel irrelevant if you don't. I mean, you were saying that around that. And maybe, Ryan, it's like, can we also just read the Gospels and read the Beatitudes and read the Sermon on the Mount? Like, part of this, I would just say, is like, it's deeply theological, and can we just read Scripture, and can we just have it read in our churches, and to not try to like argue ourselves out of the radical nature of it, but just to say, wow, like Jesus was really the great leveler. He brought down the know-it-alls and lifted up those who never felt like they had worth. And so like, do we have a theology and a biblical, and can we just allow the biblical text to live on its own because it's cool and beautiful?
Okay, I totally agree. And the last Luana's Coffee Church I did with my kids and their friends, we read the Beatitudes. And I was like, what do you think that means? And it was like mind-blowing for them. Like, didn't require much, like just read Scripture. It's insane. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Like, are we hungering and thirsting for righteousness? I don't know. We should be. But anyways, okay.
We're going to church, Ryan.
Yeah. You got to know this, huh?
In our next episode, we're going to be talking with Kris and Rachel about why you can decentralize the sermon and just move to conversations. It'll be good.
Love it.
Cool. Kris and Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your conversations with us and your own experiences. So much appreciated. Really appreciate you coming on the MyCom podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks for the invite, Ryan.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, bye, followers under 40. We hope it's helpful. Tell us if you love it. And if you don't love it, tell Kris.
Okay, what's next? Are you planning your next move? If you're feeling inspired, well, you can check out another MyCom episode. Episode 98 shares the story of a church meeting young people where they are in digital space. Good follow-up for this one. The episode entitled Connecting with the Disabled Community might be a useful follow-up here as well. I'm Ryan Dunn. I'm looking forward to connecting with you again through episode number 105 of the MyCom podcast. That's due out in 1 month's time. Find more MyCom in the meantime through resourceumc.org. That's your spot for fresh ideas and empowerment for church leadership. So I'll talk to you again very soon. In the meantime, peace.